native, first American of colonial origin who was canonized. We had to memorize the first canonized Catholic saint citizen. That was Mother Cabrini, but Elizabeth Ann Seton was our first canonized saint who was born here. It's amazing, the women figures, because Kateri Tekakwitha is the first Native American saint. So we've got kind of some amazing women figures in our history, in our personal history. Elizabeth was born in New Rochelle, New York, and her mother died when she was only 3, and her father, a doctor, remarried to a woman who was not a very good stepmother to Elizabeth. After 5 stepbrothers and sisters were born, her father and stepmother separated. At the age of 19, Elizabeth married William Seton, a merchant, and she moved into a lovely house on Wall Street, like the real Wall Street in New York City. Together, they had 5 children. Their marriage was very happy, and Elizabeth and William were devoted to each other. About the time their youngest was born, William started struggling in his business dealings. And at the same time, he became sick with tuberculosis. Now, his condition grew worse and worse, and of course, this was going hand in hand with the stress with his business. And finally, his business partners, who were actually in Italy, Antonio and Filippo Felici, invited him to come to Italy for sunshine and rest and hopefully recovery. So it sounds like a really great deal, right? Sunny Italy. On the journey across the ocean, Elizabeth accompanied him, and so did their eldest daughter, Anna. After a long and pretty difficult sea journey, William, Elizabeth, and Anna arrived at the port of Leghorn, Italy. And as you can imagine, they were very anxious to disembark. But as they left the ship, Italian soldiers came right up to them and escorted them into a quarantine station. The soldiers were concerned that William had yellow fever, and they were quarantining anybody that they thought was ill. So the 3 of them, William, Anna, and Elizabeth, would spend the better part of a month condemned to a cold, drafty, smoke-filled stone fortress. So smoke-filled because they only had a fire to heat it, and the smoke was always blowing into the house, like down the chimney and into the fortress. When they were permitted to leave that place, Will's condition had become grave. He died 2 weeks later, leaving Elizabeth and Anna in the care of the Felicis. In her grief, Elizabeth donned the black dress and bonnet of an Italian widow. That's what you see on that picture there, right? And she pretty much never took it off again. This pious Episcopalian woman was destined within a few years to become a Roman Catholic woman religious, and the black dress would become her habit. But first, a dramatic conversion had to occur, and that's the story we really want to hear. Now, up to this point in life, Elizabeth was actually quite devout. She was a devout student of the scriptures and an eager patroness of the poor. Her intimacy with God, nurtured in prayer, had made her a spiritual mother to her shivering, moaning husband in his final days. William had entered the quarantine somewhat of a lukewarm Episcopalian, but he had died fervent. Such was the power of Elizabeth's faith-filled love. In fact, she really spent those 30 days sitting with him, praying with him, and loving him, and it was quite dramatic, the conversion that he went through on his deathbed. But in the weeks that followed his death, weeks that Elizabeth spent with the Catholic Felicis, she discovered a new breadth and depth to her faith, a new power of love. And the center of all of that was the Eucharist. Seeking to cheer Elizabeth up, the Felicis, who were actually quite wonderful people, they're kind of like saints behind the saint, took her on a tour of Italy's cities. She saw churches and squares and treasures of religious art. Yet what moved Elizabeth more were the scenes of faith that played out in these spaces that she saw, these churches. This was the first time Elizabeth had seen genuine Catholic worship, and it took her by surprise when she went into a church and saw, as she described it, men and women, young and old, poor and rich, here and there, kneeling or sitting in prayer. On the altar was something she'd never seen before, the host, and a large monstrance, and everyone was attentive to him in their own way. She was witnessing adoration for the first time. And I'm just going to say, maybe it sounds like I'm kind of pumping up her story. Pretty much all of this I get straight from her own accounts. She wrote all of this. So this is Elizabeth's excitement that you hear coming through this. Elizabeth saw that the Eucharist was the center of her Italian friends' lives, and they received it almost every day. Now, all her life as a devout Protestant, she had taught her children prayers, she had devoutly attended Episcopalian services. But she actually never felt like she had enough of God. When she prayed, she was praying to a God in the sky, far away, her prayers winging upward. When she went to church, she always wanted more. Communion services were only on Sundays, and after all, it was only communion, a sign of Jesus and not Jesus himself. And she felt this keenly. She used to go from communion. She actually would go to more than one communion service on a Sunday because she was like, I can't get enough of this. She could never really slake that thirst she had for God. She just wanted to get this, to possess God, as she eventually said. But her Catholic friends, they could see Jesus and touch him and taste him. They could receive him every day if they wanted. When they were sick, someone would carry Jesus to them. They possessed God in the sacrament, is what she wrote to a friend. He was theirs, and she wanted him for herself. How I should enjoy to encounter every misery of life with the heavenly consolation of speaking heart to heart in his tabernacle and the security of finding him in his churches, she wrote. Let's just pay attention to what she said she wanted. The consolation of a heart-to-heart exchange and the security of knowing that the Lord was there. Consolation of heart-to-heart exchange and the security of his presence. So this intense desire reached a kind of fever pitch one day when Elizabeth was at the Felici home. A Eucharistic procession was going past in the street outside. I mean, this is quite wonderful. This is something that I've never had an experience of, but it seems pretty wonderful to me to have a Eucharistic procession going by your house. And as the monstrance passed below her window, Elizabeth was in agony. She threw herself down on the floor of her room. She wanted so desperately to believe that that was Jesus going by. And in this moment, her eyes went heavenward, and all the power of the many images of the Madonna and Child that she had seen in Italy came to her mind. Later, she described what happened to her. She said, I looked up to the Blessed Virgin and appealed to her that, as the mother of God, she must pity me. She wanted Mary to help her believe that Jesus was present. Now, I think this is an amazing scene. You know, Protestant woman throws herself on the ground as the Eucharist goes past and begs Mary to help her know that Jesus is present. Like, you got to know she's on the path. She's on the path, right? But it did take some time for Elizabeth to come into the church because she knew that when she did that, her life and the life of her children would change dramatically. When Elizabeth returned to New York, and she was just a few months in Italy, she found herself in the middle of a battle. As soon as her Protestant friends and family and pastor realized what had happened, right, that she was contemplating joining the Papists, they pleaded and argued with her. So a battle raged for months, with Elizabeth torn between what she had seen in the Catholic faith in the Catholic churches and the faith that represented her entire world, really, her whole family and all of her friends. She kept going to the Episcopal Church, yet she could not deny what had happened to her. And this is a quote from her. One day I got into a side pew at the Episcopal Church and turned my face toward the Catholic Church in the next street and found myself 20 times speaking to the Blessed Sacrament there instead of looking at the naked altar where I was. And so, at long last, Elizabeth gave in and she came into the church. It was a dramatic change. It meant leaving behind much of her old life. Her family would not support her. Many friends drew back from her. After years of attending services with the New York elite, because she really hung out with the elite, she would be going to Mass with the immigrants that attended St. Peter's Church on Barclay Street, which was the only Catholic church in New York City at the time. But for Elizabeth, this was nothing compared to what she had gained. These are her words of joy on the day of her first Holy Communion. At last, God is mine and I am his. Now let it all go round. I have received him. To the last breath of life, will I not remember this night of watching from morning dawn, the long walk to town, but every step counted, nearer that street, then nearer that tabernacle, then nearer the moment he would enter. And when he did, the first thought I remember was, let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. For it seemed to me that my king had come to take his throne. It was the triumph of joy and gladness that the deliverer was come, and my defense and shield and strength and salvation made mine for this world and the next. That's what Elizabeth was so like, I want this for my own. The Eucharist is God come to earth, the fulfillment of our needs and desires. And Elizabeth was a woman liberated by Christ. And this sense of liberation continued her entire life and was always associated with the Eucharist. A great work was about to begin. Despite all the difficulties, after all, she was a mother of 5 small children, a widow, Elizabeth became the foundress of the first female religious congregation on American soil, with schools in Baltimore and Emmitsburg, Maryland. Her life was not without much toil and suffering. Eventually, 2 of her daughters who came to the convent with her would die of tuberculosis, and she was there with them as they died, before the same disease would take her own life, Elizabeth's life. Yet she was ever consoled by the heart-to-heart exchange, the security of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Elizabeth was only 46 when she died. Sometimes it's amazing what God can do so quickly in people's lives. And her deathbed scene testifies to the amazing strength she drew her entire life from the Eucharist. On her last night, she insisted that she be permitted to fast, even from medicine, so that she might receive him worthily. One last communion, and then eternity, she sighed. And I'll just say as a side point, I do another talk for the On the Road about women in the Catholic Church, and something that's truly extraordinary in this moment is that the priest, Father Brute, who was her spiritual director, was there living through this deathbed scene with her, and he wrote afterwards that it was one of the most profound moments in his entire life. It completely changed his faith. This is the way Elizabeth Ann Seton died. And he begged God, if only I could have the faith of this woman. Elizabeth is a great witness to us of how to live and how to die, and she is a great teacher for us in the way of prayer. Elizabeth wanted security and the communion of a heart-to-heart exchange. She wanted to feel God's presence, and she wanted a mother. And she went to God with all of this need. And this is the foundation of all good prayer, this openness, this willingness to name our thirst, to let ourselves be moved by our deepest desires. So that's Elizabeth. I'm going to take a drink. We'll go on. Blessed Carlo Acutis. So our next saint began and ended his life's journey in his boyhood, right? His name is Carlo Acutis, and he died only 17 years ago in 2006 in Milan, Italy. He is our first millennial saint. He was 15 and a half when he died, and since then he has become Blessed Carlo Acutis, which means that he is most of the way towards being named a canonized saint. His life has been examined for evidence of holiness. There are many people publicly venerating him, and a miracle that cannot be explained by science has already been attributed to him. So those are all things that are required for the process of canonization. He has one more miracle that if the second miracle is approved, he will be named a saint. but he can be publicly venerated. That's what blessed means, that he's now available to us for public veneration. Carlo was the only child of a wealthy Italian family, and although his parents had him baptized, they did not go to Mass. But from the time Carlo was very little, he began to ask those in charge of him, his parents, and the caretakers that his parents hired, to take him to Mass every day. So one influence that I don't talk about really in this talk was that there was a Catholic domestic servant in the home that did teach him a little bit, but mostly it was coming from him. When he was 6, he approached the priest at the church and asked for First Holy Communion. And his parents, of course, had not taken him to any catechism classes. The priest recognized that something very unusual was happening in this young boy, and he asked him to come to a monastery where cloistered nuns were living for his first communion. And in this silent, solemn Mass, Carlo received Jesus for the first time. And the nuns later reported that they saw him through the grill, how he squirmed in anticipation for his first taste of Jesus, and then seemed to burst with excitement afterwards. The lives of the saints are filled with lots of stories of child holiness. And a lot of times people say to me, oh, please don't tell me about these stories where the child was so holy from the age of 3. Because everybody thinks that's legendary, but Carlo actually shows us that it isn't, right? In Carlo, our contemporary, we can see that holiness is real, and it's for all of us. This is not just a story from the past. It is happening here and now. After his first communion, Carlo received communion every day. It was the source of his strength. We can say that what filled Carlo up, what caused his joy and peace and compassion for others, was really the bread of life. The Eucharist fed him. The Eucharist is my highway to heaven, he used to say. At 11, he became a catechist helper. And when he died at 15 and a half, he knew most of the catechism of the Catholic Church by heart, which just blows me away. And embarrasses me a bit because as a theologian, I don't know if I know any of the catechism of the Catholic Church by heart, but it's something to aspire towards. Yet Carlo lived an ordinary life. He enjoyed all the things boys love: his dogs, playing soccer, making videos with his video camera, and gaming with his friends. Saints are not people who are not human. Rather, coming close to God enables them and us to become more human. Getting close to Jesus makes us more the persons we are meant to be. Adoration grounded Carlo. In addition to receiving the Eucharist every day, he spent time in adoration before and after Mass, 10 or 15 minutes of simple silent prayer. And I have to say that I have a young woman that I'm kind of mentoring a little bit right now, and she recently told me she was really upset because they reorganized the parishes, and she said, there used to be adoration in my parish, and there's no longer adoration, and she was really upset. And I said, well, why don't you do the Carlo Acutis adoration? Come to Mass 15 minutes early, leave 15 minutes late, and give Jesus that time before and after Mass. She thought that was a good idea, so I was happy about that. Carlo compared adoration to going out in the sun to get a tan. But when we get in front of Jesus, he said, we become saints. Carlo's advice for what to do when we have some time to pray before our Lord was very simple. He said, I like to speak to Jesus about all that I am living and feeling. And he also said, to him, I can always confide something. I can also complain, question him about his silence, and tell him what I do not understand. And then, within me, I find a word that he sends me, a moment of the gospel that fills me with conviction and certainty. Such a really simple formula for prayer. The adults in Carlo's life were in wonder in front of him. Carlo's mom was not a believer, but she saw that something was happening with her son. He guided her in the way that God was guiding him. And today she is a beautiful witness. In fact, you can go on YouTube and watch. She does a lot of witnesses on her experience of being Carlo's mom. One of the things that God did for Carlo one of the things that Carlo did was convince his parents to take summer vacation in Assisi and to visit holy places for vacation. So he is actually buried in Assisi. Was his favorite place to go, where St. Francis is from. Another person in his life was Rajesh, the Indian domestic servant in his home. Carlo talked to Rajesh all about the faith, and Rajesh decided he wanted to be baptized. Like Carlo, he developed a love for the Eucharist. He looked forward with great excitement to his first communion, and when he received confirmation, it was just as Carlo said. He received a much deeper and more powerful love for the Eucharist from that time. And I have to say, when I read this about Carlo, I had a son who received confirmation last year, and I said to him, and he took our Carlo Acutis as his confirmation saint, and I said, well, make sure you pray for this grace, that you have a deeper love of the Eucharist when you receive your confirmation. He's 16 now, and so of course he won't talk to me about any of that. So Carlo was a very smart boy. As I said, he was into gaming, and he had a fascination and a talent for coding. He decided to build his own website, and you can go on and see this online. It's called miracolieucharistici.org, and I should have put it on your sheet there, sorry. But if you look up Carlo Acutis, you can find it. And he devoted it to sharing the truth about Eucharistic miracles. His favorite was the miracle that had occurred in Lanciano, Italy, around the year 730, and I put a little picture of this on the sheet there. That year, the village priest had been struggling to believe that what Jesus says is true, that his flesh is true food and his blood true drink. He begged the Lord to come to his aid, and one day while he was saying Mass, the host and the wine changed into real flesh and real blood. It was a miracle, and the body and blood are still preserved today in Italy. The flesh was analyzed by specialists in 1970, and it turned out to be myocardial or heart tissue, and the blood, which appears fresh, belongs to the AB group, so real human flesh and blood. So I've already told you that Carlo died at 15 and a half. One day he came down what seemed like the flu, but he got much sicker in a week, and his parents took him to the hospital. He was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia that attacks the blood cells. It was fatal. In the final week of his life, Carlo suffered much, but he offered up that suffering for the Pope and the Church. He had his heart set on the highest things. Our goal, he said, must be infinite, not the finite. The infinite is our homeland. Heaven has been waiting for us forever. When Carlo died, many people showed up at the funeral that his parents did not know, poor people. It turned out that Carlo had befriended the homeless people he met walking to school and to Mass every day. He would bring them money and food. So how did he have the strength to do all this, right? It's amazing what this kid did in such a short life. The answer, I think, is the love that he was experiencing, the sunbathing. Carlo was basking in God's love, and God was just loving this kid like crazy. And Carlo just let that love radiate to other people. But does this sound too much? Does it seem impossible to you? I used to think that feeling loved as Carlo did and wanting to love as Carlo did was impossible for me. But like I said at the beginning, spending time with the saints has helped me see this more and more as a possibility. God is loving all of us like crazy. This is the meaning of the cross and the resurrection, by the way. Why, you guys are so lucky, you people that are resurrection people, to have this image. Oh my gosh. 50 days of Easter, 40 days of Lent, what does that show you? That's the center, is the resurrection. It's amazing. God gives his only Son to die for us, and he rises. This is a crazy sort of love. And he wants all of us to know this love, so what can we do? Now, last summer, I taught a course at St. Bernard's on American Saints and Blesseds, so I was fortunate enough to get a little bit into Fulton Sheen, who I had not really known anything about. And Fulton Sheen used to say that people don't realize there is a door between us and God, but the latch to that door is on our side. God loves us, but he will not force us. Love always involves letting the other be free. But if we open the latch and pull the door open, God will come rushing into our lives. This is just what Carlo Acutis did, and I think anybody can do that. So how can we let God in? Carlo can help us with this. What he was always saying, and the church in fact teaches, is that it is primarily through the sacramental life that our lives really become transformed, okay? This is important because this is different from the way most of us think about how we change, okay? It is tempting to think that the saints are all really just great triers, that their lives are really just about performing heroic act after heroic act, really hard stuff, right? But the truth is that God has been attracting them and drawing them in love. And we can experience that same attraction by just staying close to God. The Eucharist, confession, these are there for us, and we really have to just show up. So don't forget that parable where the Lord invites in the blind, the lame, and the homeless. That's all he really wants, is the weakest ones just to show up. So one more thing that you might feel challenged by here with Carlo is, you think he's 15 and a half, what did he do? He couldn't have done too many bad things in his life by 15, right? And then, if you've lived a longer life, you're pretty overwhelmed with your sins, your wounds, your mistakes. We all have these. Those are the ways we maybe have been challenged to accept the invitation to unlatch the door, right? But Carlos says the conversion of the heart is not really that complicated. And this is my favorite quote from him. Sadness is the gaze turned towards oneself. Happiness is the gaze turned towards God. Conversion is nothing other than lifting our gaze from low, right, looking at myself, to high, looking at him. Just a simple movement of the eyes. Now, I'll just tell you something about this quote. It's startlingly close to a quote from St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a doctor of the church, which suggests, of course, that Carlo Acutis was really getting some divine wisdom when he was very young. His witness is startlingly simple. Don't spend your time navel-gazing. That's St. Augustine, okay? Look at what God has done. Keep looking at what he's doing. Go sunbathing. Be in his presence. Consider that he lived for us, he died for us, he rose for us, he comes to feed us, to share his life. He can change us in every way. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Look up. All right, last figure, Charles de Foucauld. Charles de Foucauld, and he's very recently canonized saint. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago that he was canonized. 2 years ago, I believe. He's a very new saint. He was canonized, I wrote it on here, 2020. That's good, that was great. I'm right on top of this. Charles was born in 1858 in Strasbourg, France, so he's 1800s. And he was born to a devout family, but both of his parents died when he was 6. He was at that time taken in by his grandfather, a Colonel Morlaix. He was an army man. And his grandfather shared with him his love for geography and history. But he also spoiled Charles. By the time he was in his teens, Charles had decided that he no longer needed God. So he just stopped everything, completely left the faith. And he kind of embarked on a life of pleasure. His grandfather convinced him to go to military school, and at 18, when he did enter the military school, he was so overweight from basically partying that when he got to the school, they could not find a uniform to fit him. His nickname in military school was Piggy. He graduated at the bottom of his class. Next, he was sent to cavalry school, right, to learn to ride a horse and fight in battle. While he was in that school, his grandfather died, and Charles received a very large inheritance. Now he began drinking and partying more than ever. This is a quote from Charles at this time. "I rent women by the day. I don't sign a lease." Some people have said he makes Augustine look really tame. Again, he graduated at the bottom of his class. But 2 years after that, he and his classmates were assigned to their first military post in Algeria. He showed up in Algeria and brought a woman with him, a mistress, who was posing as his wife. But when this was discovered, he was suspended. So he was out of the army. But something started to change at this point. His classmates began to see action, and when Charles found out, hungry for adventure, he decided to go and join them. So he left his mistress behind and joined his classmates in Algeria. He began to distinguish himself, and it was in Algeria, a French colony in North Africa, that he first fell in love. But what he fell in love with was the landscape, the country, the people. The country had a stark, unforgettable beauty that captured him. And when he finished serving in the army, he signed up to stay there. He got a job as an explorer, which is quite an adventurous thing. The land was being opened to Europeans for the first time, and he spent 11 months traveling through northern Africa, going into jungles and down rivers that no European had ever seen. He was mapping the land and recording what he saw. In this same time, religion entered his life again, but in a kind of a weird way. In order to travel safely, he posed as a Jewish rabbi, so people were always thinking that he was a devout Jew. But what most impressed him were the Muslims he met. He saw this kind of muscular Muslim masculinity, right? But they were faithful. And this gave him a vision of masculine faith. And this was interesting to him. At this point, just interesting. At the end of the 11 months, he returned to France, and he wrote a book about his explorations, and that was actually extremely well received in scientific circles. And his family was thrilled to see him, his remaining family that was in France, but a little bit worried about him because he had been a partier, and they knew for sure he was no longer in the church. So they started trying to think up ways that they could draw him into the faith again. They started hosting events and introducing him to kind of Catholics that maybe could pique his interest. And at this time, two amazing people entered his life. The first one was actually his cousin. Her name was Marie. Marie was a beautiful woman. She was a believer, and she was made more beautiful by the faith that she professed. She never, ever tried to convert Charles. She sought only to love him. And this was about the best thing she could have done. It made him hopeful, searching, and open. Moreover, her faith was not just piety. She was a very intelligent Catholic, and her reason was fully engaged. And that made Charles think that perhaps everything he had been taught when he was a child could be true. He began to read Catholic books. He began to study the faith. Then he began to try to pray. He started visiting churches all over the city, and he would sit there in the back of the church in the dark and make his plea, "God, if you exist, let me know you." He wanted to know God, but he didn't feel that he had faith, and he didn't feel like he was making any contact. The second person he met was a priest, Abbé Uvelan, who immediately impressed him with his knowledge of the faith and his capacity for love. He met him at one of the family events. One day, Charles' desire for an answer to his prayers consumed him. He could stand it no longer. He went to the church where Abbe Uvelan was hearing confessions and went into the confessional. He wanted to talk, but that's not exactly the way it turned out. He said to the priest, "Father, I do not have faith. Please teach me." And Abbe Uvelan looked at him. "Kneel down and confess to God, and you will believe." He said, "Make a confession." "But I didn't come for that," Charles said. "Just confess," the priest said. So Charles knelt down and did a really long confession, right? Pouring out all the sins and struggles of his growing up years. Who he wounded, but also in the process, how he was wounded. Showing how he was wounded. Because confession is a sacrament of healing, a sacrament in which our sufferings are opened up, but then Christ's grace pours in and transforms them. At the end, the priest asked him, "Are you fasting?" And Charles said, yes. Basically, he was saying, "Have you eaten today?" And Abbe Uvelan said, "Well, they're about to start Mass. Go to communion." Charles went to the Mass that was happening in the church at the same time, and he received communion for the first time since he was a boy. It was his second first communion. And this communion became the beginning of a new life. And he later said, "From the moment I realized that God existed, I knew I could not do otherwise than to live for him alone." Charles has got an amazing story. Like the second he had faith, he received a profound vocation. What had happened? Well, he had been baptized, right? When we are baptized, faith, hope, and charity enter our souls. The Trinity dwells within us. But, of course, he'd committed lots of sins, and what was holding him back from faith, from that encounter with God, were the ways he had stepped away from God. I mean, in Charles's story, you see that everything we learn in catechism is true. Sin really does close that door between us and God. And he needed to restore the connection, and that's what he did that day. He restored the connection. He unlatched the door and threw it open wide, and God rushed in. Now this vocation emerged. Father Uvelan had spoken to him, and they became very close friends. In fact, Father Uvelan really became his spiritual director for the rest of his life. They did mostly through mail. But he'd spoken to him of the hidden life of Jesus in Nazareth. "Our Lord so took the lowest place that no one has been able to take it from him," he said. And Charles became captivated by this idea of Christ's poverty and humility at Nazareth, his hidden life. And he wanted to live just as Jesus had, to be poor, to live simply, and just to love. So at first he thought that the ideal would be to become a Trappist, like we have down at the Abbey of the Genesee, right? That kind of austere monastic life seemed to match with his desires. And he actually effortlessly entered into a pretty harsh regimen. He had after all lived very sparsely on his expeditions. He actually said he learned chastity when he was on that expedition because there weren't any women around. But even though the Trappist life appealed to him, he felt that something was missing. He actually felt like he needed to go further and enter more deeply into God's littleness. So after 6 years, he got permission to leave the Trappists and go to the Holy Land, and got a job as a carpenter for some nuns. And I just love this because he was just going to imitate Jesus. I'm going to go to the Holy Land and become a carpenter, right? He loved this time. He was able to pray many hours a day and to work in simplicity and silence and to live a very poor life. But truth be told, he was actually not a very good carpenter. And after a while, the nuns saw how devout he was, and they started suggesting that maybe he had a call to the priesthood. And although at first this didn't appeal to him, eventually he came to believe that this was really the next step in his life. And he actually went to the seminary at this time, and it was quite a suffering to leave to leave that life he was living in the Holy Land and to go to the seminary. But he was captivated with a new idea. The priest is the one who can bring Jesus hidden in the Eucharist to any place, even the most forgotten ones. And this gave him a kind of a direction for his life. He decided after he was ordained that he would be a missionary, and he knew where he wanted to go. He would return to North Africa, to the Sahara, where there were no missionaries, no priests, very few Catholics, and live the simple life of Nazareth there. At the age of 42, he was ordained a priest of Viviers, France, and granted permission to go on mission to the Sahara. His earlier life was a preparation for this final vocation. First at Beni Abbas, then at Tamarset in modern Algeria, barren desert places, he found his place as a missionary. The amazing thing with Charles's life is that you see how nothing is wasted in life. God uses everything for his purposes. His missionary goal was to bring the Lord to the interior of Africa, to be present just as the Lord is present in the Eucharist, humble, hidden, but a wellspring of love. His life was a life for everyone, the Muslims, both the Arabs and the native Tuareg tribesmen. So the native nomadic tribesmen had been converted to Islam. He lived among them. He called himself Brother Charles, brother to all. And he wore a habit, as you can see with the picture that I gave you, with a Sacred Heart affixed to the front of his chest, a sign of the love he felt in himself. And he wanted to display that for everyone. He ministered to the poor. He ransomed slaves. He helped people in all circumstances. During a famine, he worked incessantly to feed people. He taught children, ministered to the French soldiers. He began to translate the Bible into the language of the tribesmen. He wanted, he said, and this is a quote, to shout the gospel with my life. I would like to be sufficiently good that people would say, if such is the servant, what must the master be like? Yet, in this time, no one was converted. The Muslim tribesmen were defensive towards Catholics and Europeans, and the only people that visited the Blessed Sacrament in his little chapel were the French soldiers who were passing through. Charles wrote a little rule, right, like a guidebook for an entire order that would follow in his path. He called them the little brothers of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And he felt certain that others would join him to undertake this work of transforming the life of the tribesmen through prayer, charity, and poverty. He wrote lots of letters to Europe inviting people to join him, but no one came. Charles was on mission for 14 years when World War I broke out. Half of the tribes in the country were loyal to France. The other half were inciting rebellion against the French presence. Of course, Charles was suspect simply because he was French, although he had only ever done good for the tribesmen. He knew the danger and moved into a fortified building, a little fort, to wait out the trouble. On December 1, 1916, some of these rebels broke into the little fort. They tied him up and questioned him at gunpoint. As they were doing this, 2 French soldiers rode up to the fort. The soldier who was holding Charles, a 15-year-old, panicked, and he shot the priest at point-blank range. He was killed instantly. Now, Charles de Foucauld had prepared for this moment his whole life. He had written in the front page of his breviary, "Live every day as if you will be martyred." What was his strength in that desert place so far from home? It was the Eucharist. The Eucharist generated his life, gave him peace and consolation. In the rule he wrote for the order that never happened, adoration took pride of place, and he himself spent 3.5 hours a day in adoration. Although I just was reading on his website, there's a great website devoted to him, so much information. that actually that adoration time became more and more compressed because he was such a center for the people, and they just were coming into him for everything. He was really the heart of their life. These are these poor nomadic tribesmen. He wrote in his journal, "Right now I am in a state of great peace." And this is when he's alone, right? Nobody is coming and nobody's converting. "Right now I'm in a state of great peace. This will last as long as Jesus wants. I have the Blessed Sacrament and the love of Jesus. Others have the earth. I have the good Lord. When I am sad, here is my cure. I say the glorious mysteries of the Rosary, and I tell myself, after all, what difference does it make if I am poor and nothing good comes of the good I hope for? None of that keeps our beloved Jesus, who wants the good 1,000 times more than I, from being blessed, eternally and infinitely blessed." Charles' life and death are actually a witness to the incredible power of the Eucharist. It can sustain us in any circumstance, and it has powers that lie beyond time and human abilities. Like I said, Charles had envisioned an order that would be formed to bring Christ to the tribesmen. Today, 20 different communities have arisen that derive their spirituality from Charles de Foucauld. Some of them take their rule. There is a little Brothers of the Sacred Heart. There are little Sisters of the Sacred Heart. According to his website, there are 20,000 people in the world that basically consider him a founding member of their community, or a founder. And this is one man who lived only for Jesus. I often tell my students, so if you've been in my classes, maybe you've heard me say this, that one of the things that's so amazing about saints, and you see this in Charles's life so amazingly, is that if you really open your heart to God, like wide open, he only needs your heart. Like, we don't have to think about success, right? He's got it under control. He gets one heart. He gets Charles's heart, and he's got these 20,000 other people, right? He gets one Mother Teresa. He gets the missionaries of charity. I mean, this is the amazing way. This is the amazing math of God. So here we are. I'm at the end of the talk, and I'm going to use the same line I used at the Eucharistic Congress. I didn't do the exact same talk at the Eucharistic Congress. This is pretty different, a little overlap. But as I said at the Eucharistic Congress, when I get to the end of these saint stories, I feel like there's nothing really that I can add to this, to what they give us, right? So instead, let's sum it all up, okay? Carlo teaches us to take the gaze off of ourselves and look at the Lord in his power. He invites us to go sunbathing in adoration. Elizabeth teaches us to pray with abandon, to let the Lord answer our deepest hunger and thirst. And Charles teaches us that nothing is wasted in life. The Lord has a great future plan for each of us, and this future is possible because he loves us as he does. So as Charles says, may he be blessed, the Lord be blessed, eternally and infinitely blessed. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions or comments or discussion. Yes. Yes. Well, she was there the whole time. The daughter was kind of part of the whole journey, and it's really beautiful to read about the way that, it's funny because they got back to the States, and Elizabeth was kind of trying to suppress the Catholic thing, because, she's back with all the Episcopalians. And her daughter would say, well, Mom, aren't we going to pray the Hail Mary? And stuff like that, because her daughter had picked that up. So her daughter was part of the influence. And it was a big drama for Elizabeth, because she took it so seriously that when she became Catholic, her children were going to come into the church too. And she had this sense of, I have to really give my whole self to making this decision. I have to really, and so it was hard for her in that sense, that she felt the weight of that. But her story, there's a whole other story to learn to be told with Elizabeth Ann Seton. Her relationship to her kids, they weren't perfect children. Children of saints aren't necessarily saints. Sometimes they are actually, but they aren't always. But you do see the ways that the parents' devotion and attachment to the Lord, you do see a trickle down. You really do. I think you see that. Thanks for asking that. Yes, there was another question back here.
I was wondering, Carla was so young. What were the miracles that were attributed to her?
I can't remember. I'm sorry, and I have read them. But the miracle that I refer to here is of course it's a posthumous miracle. So after they die, there has to be, after a person dies, there has to be proof that we have to have, somebody has to come forward and say, we were praying to Carlo Acutis, and then this thing happened, and there's a huge investigation, right? Because they have to verify that you were praying to like 5 other saints at the time, and also that it's considered inexplicable in terms of modern science. So, but are you asking if there are miracles that he made happen in his lifetime? Yeah, I don't know of any off the top of my head, although, one of the quotes, I probably should have put it in here. There's a beautiful quote from one of his teachers who said that, he was a kid in a school, just a regular school. It was a Jesuit school. And one of his teachers said that, just every place he went, he changed. Things changed around him. They just changed around him. To me, that's the radiation of love, right? Love changes realities. But I don't know if that's a very good question. I don't have an answer for that. Whether there were other miracles that he performed in his life.
Well, I was wondering about Charles too.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I don't know. Strictly speaking, for someone to become a saint, they don't have to have actually done a miracle in their lifetime. It's just it's by the intercession that comes after they die. So intercession means that people decide to ask them for help, to pray to them for help. So that's what the church looks at, is what happens after they die. It isn't, they don't necessarily have miracles associated with them, although there are plenty of modern saints. There are books written on miracles that are associated with John Paul II, for instance, or Padre Pio. So plenty of stories of that, but not all saints had those kinds of lives. Saints are all different. They're all over the place. Yes.
The single most category for the sainthood is heroic virtue. That's what they're looking for. Heroic virtue.
Right. Thank you. Yes.
That all of those other religious orders, if you want to call them, came from him.
Well, in Charles' case, it would be how he lived his life selflessly. He gave himself so wholly to the other people.
Yeah.
So the virtue he lived was charity. He gave himself.
The beautiful thing about that I try to bring out is that the supernatural fruit, maybe we would call it supernatural fruitfulness of his life, right? Because when you look at someone and they die and you think, well, he didn't do anything, he didn't accomplish anything that he wanted, but actually God finishes the work by drawing all these people. So that's a beautiful witness to the reality of, well, it's a reality for all of us, which is that we do what we do, and we trust that the effects, the outcomes, really are in God's hands. We don't have that. We really don't have to be concerned about outcomes, and that's the quote from him that's so beautiful. He's like, okay, it's okay if I don't see amazing things happen. I have Jesus here with me, and that's the most amazing thing. I mean, what God wants is that closeness, that presence with us. So that's the most satisfying thing ultimately, and that's really what the saints testify to. So there was another question. Yes, sir. Yeah, I didn't mention him because I have to do more research on the father, because when you go onto the online videos, it's always his mom talking. And I've been very struck by that. And so I'm going to have to try to find out something about his father. I mean, I don't know whether his father is just very private. You just don't know what the actual situation is. So that's a very good question. It wouldn't scandalize me if we found out his father is a person who's struggling, because life has to unfold in a human way. We let it unfold. God lets it unfold in a human way. He works through human circumstances. So,
And I think we were really blessed to be able to have the Eucharistic miracle display.
oh yes, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. That's amazing. So that was.
Passion and resurrection, we were able to put up the display during the first year of the Eucharistic revival. So it's kind of amazing that nobody had thought about doing this, and this young kid that's good with computers cataloged all of those
Yeah.
all of those Eucharistic miracles for us.
Yeah. It's interesting when you say that, like nobody had thought of it. Last night we were talking about this in I'm co-teaching a class on Mary. It's a Mariology course. And one of the things that we talked about was, Mary, everything is new in Mary, right? But that's the beauty of sanctity. Like when I say everything is new, what do I mean? Well, she's the beginning of the new covenant, right? So, everything is opened up in her life in a way that's mysterious even for her. But, that was one of the discussions that we had, was this idea of, sanctity is partly about just being open to the newness that God wants to bring into the world. I mean, if you think about what it is to have, God calls us each to a mission, right? We each have an individual mission. And that means that each one of us is being called to bring something into the world that's never been here before. We don't, there's no, like, that was another Carlo Acuta's quote. He said, there are no photocopies. There are no photocopies. Nobody. So one of the ways to go into the relationship with the Lord is the excitement of the adventure of discovering what he's got that's only for you. He has a relationship with just you, and it's unique and mind-blowing, and that's what you see in these saints. You see that they kind of go all in with that. Other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
No, she said it was ironic that Elizabeth can't see praying to Mary.
Yes.
What was it about the Eucharist?
Okay. It was ironic because, so that's when the monstrance was passing by our window in the Eucharistic procession, and she's struggling with, okay, I want to believe that's Jesus, but I don't have that faith yet. And so she throws herself on the ground and she prays to Mary. And, I said it's ironic because usually, when someone's not Catholic, when they're Protestant, or Elizabeth was Episcopalian, Mary is like the last thing to come into place for them, like in terms of belief. Usually it's the Pope and the Pope and Mary are the last thing, because those are two things that Protestants struggle with. And so it's interesting that Elizabeth is like got the Mary piece comes right in very quickly for her, and that Mary leads her to Jesus in her journey, because that's a little bit of an unusual thing. But I kind of alluded to it. It's interesting that her mother died when she was so young, and she had this very unpleasant woman as a stepmother. And so I love the aspect it's just so illustrative for us in the life of prayer of, like she really was aware of her wound. And she kind of got, like when she wrote, she wrote to a friend from Italy, I who have struggled so much with the desire to have a mother, I'm now seeing the mother of the Lord as my mother. So it was just like, I have this need and it's going to be answered. So.
That was actually that was my question. The Protestants had to deal with Mary.
Yeah.
Is there, did she find that a stumbling block? I guess not.
She didn't. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, like it's a very, there were a lot of arguments kind of that her friends had, and they used all of this. They would say, you're not going to pray to Mary, you're not going to pray to the saints. But she seemed to have just kind of slipped into this really good space with Mary in Italy, which is like a good place to slip into a good space with Mary, I think, because, all of the art, beautiful art.
Well, you said she was praying to Hail Mary as her daughter. She had learned that.
Yes.
And prayerfulness was her thing.
Yeah.
So that was probably maybe the connection with Mary to her.
Yeah.
Maybe that was the conduit, with her.
Yeah.
Mother Mary, was the fact that she was prayerfully saying this prayer and believing it and paying attention to every aspect of it. And maybe that helped her make the connection.
Yes, no, I think that's definitely part of it. The prayer was a really big thing for her. There was one more. Yes, sir.
Is there someplace online that we can read the articles on the saints that she wrote?
That's kind of you to ask that. Actually, no, Magnificat doesn't have those online. I wish they did, but I write for Seton Shrine, for the Elizabethan Seton Shrine, which is, their website is setonshrine.org. And I've done about 50 essays for them on 50 different saints. So, and actually I really love that opportunity because it's a longer form, so I tell more of the story. And the really cool thing is that I have to loop it into the life of Elizabeth Ann Seton because it's a Seton Shrine. So they really, you always get a little Elizabeth Ann Seton nugget in there too. So thank you for asking. That's very sweet of you. All right, well, this was beautiful. Thank you for your patience, for letting me share these favorite stories of mine. And yeah, let's just keep doing this with the saints. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you for sharing those inspiring stories. And just to let everyone know that St. Bernard's on the Road is coming back. This time, February 21st at 6:30 at the Church of the Assumption. And that would be Professor Kuhner, and he's going to be presenting Mary and the Eucharist. Thank you so much. God bless you. Have a restful night.